Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mad Manners. Yes, every week during the cricket season, I'll be doing a solo episode. And in this episode, I'm going to go into what makes this Australian team tick. This podcast has been going for over 11 years, so I've been lucky enough to interview multiple times many of the players in the test side. I've also commentated on many of the players at domestic level, and I feel like I know them pretty well. Not like we're mates, but I feel like I understand what makes a lot of these players tick. So for my sort of special summer preview, I'm going to get in depth into what makes this Aussie team tick. But before that, little factoid to start things off. And they do say that you can learn something every day. And today I learned that the arch villain from James Bond, Ernst Stavro Blofeld, has a link to cricket. Yes, that's right. He's actually named after cricket commentator Henry Blofeld's father. So Ian Fleming was good mates with Henry Blofeld's dad. And when he was writing his book, I can't remember which book it was, but where Spectre first comes into the James Bond series, he used Henry Blofeld's dad's last name as the last name for this arch villain of James Bond. So you learn something every day. I would not have expected that connection between James Bond and cricket, but there we go. The arch villain in James Bond is named after Henry Blofeld's father. All right. Couple of bits of news before we get into my summer preview. Firstly, it has been confirmed today that Cameron Green will undergo back surgery and will miss this summer's cricket. They estimate 6 months rehabilitation. That usually means 6 months to a year, because in my experience, normally is a really heavy 6 months of rehabilitation. Then you've got another 6 months where they're getting back into cricket and building up to being able to play test matches and matches. So I don't think we'll see Cameron Green partake in a lot of international cricket until next summer in Australia. I think until then it'll be a lot of tough work for him. I think it's the right decision. If he's going to be plagued by back issues throughout his career, why not take your medicine now, take a break, get it sorted out, and then maybe you come back a better cricketer, a more durable cricketer, a cricketer being able to bowl longer spells, being able to push his body a bit more. So it's a huge blow to this Australian side, though. Cameron Green was such an integral member of the side, and we've talked on the Cricket Unfiltered podcast about what it means having him ruled out for the summer, because well, it could mean two things. Firstly, Steve Smith could move straight back to number 4 where Cameron Green was, and they could bring in a specialist opener. Or if they want a like-for-like replacement, they could pick a young all-rounder such as an Aaron Hardy or a Bo Webster, and therefore you still have to find out who's going to open the batting with Usman Khawaja. I think this Australian team in a 5-test series against India will need an all-rounder in that top 6, but you could make a case that between Mitch Marsh and Marnus Labuschagne, they can take 10, 15 overs a day between them, and then you don't have to bring in another all-rounder. You can bring in a specialist opening batter. Anyway, lots of moving parts with the Australian team now with this news. We will get into that in the next episode of the Cricket Unfiltered podcast. Don't you worry about that. Now, before I get into previewing this Australian side, just want to play some audio from Pete Lawler and Gideon Hayes' podcast. Now, those that listen to Cricket Unfiltered, the Cricket Unfiltered podcast, will know that I was pretty upset with them a few weeks ago when they had Mike Coward on their show and failed to correct him when he was praising Peter Roebuck's work in Africa. Let me just say, I really like Gideon and Peter. They are great guys. They made a mistake that day, but everybody makes mistakes. But you know, they helped me. They helped me when I started the podcast at News Limited. I also helped them, I think, learn how to podcast. So it was mutually beneficial. But I just found, as I said, it frustrating that two people with the intelligence that they have, who know what Peter Roebuck did. So let me just go through it one more time. Mike Coward was praising the work Peter Roebuck did with young African men helping with their education and stuff. Where when it has since come out that part of that helping was also grooming them and then sexually assaulting them. There are statements from these young men who were victims of Peter Roebuck. I know it's a complicated story, but I found it very frustrating that Peter Lawler, especially, who on Twitter is this social justice warrior, when it comes to correcting one of his own colleagues, he just sat on his hands. So I think both of those guys probably should look inward a little bit and reflect on those actions. And as I said, it's a bit hypocritical of Peter Lawler because, he's a social justice warrior on Twitter, but he should maybe concentrate on issues closer to home. And if you have someone on your podcast that is going to gloss over a former colleague sexually assaulting young men, and let's just look at the optics, 3 white guys just glossing over one of their white colleagues assaulting young black men in Africa. So, as I said, Pete, and to a lesser extent, Gideon, I would say look inward, brother. All right, now to the comments Tim Payne made on their podcast. I'm a big fan of Tim Payne. Have a listen to what he had to say about being in the media.
But I think I've got to be careful in cricket now. I am a head coach in a big competition in Australia. So for me, I might hold back a little bit of opinion stuff in terms of what's going on in Australian 2020 cricket.
Yeah.
Given that I'm now linked to a number of players and organisations. But outside of that, I like to give my opinion because I think people deserve to know what you're thinking. It's your job to give it, and it might upset some people, but I'd like to think the world will change and we'll go back to, maybe a decade ago where people said what they think a bit more.
Well, there you have it. Tim Payne talking about what it's like to be in the media. I like how he was honest there that now he's coaching the Adelaide Strikers. He needs to be a bit careful what he says around, the BBL and the WBBL and T20 cricket, because being the coach of the Adelaide Strikers means he's in a pretty high position. So he has to be careful. But, at the end there, I don't know if he's been listening to Cricket Unfiltered, because I certainly haven't been shy about giving my opinions in the last 10 years. And I think he needs to listen to this show. If he's looking for someone to give his opinions, then tune into Cricket Unfiltered. But it's interesting how he understands that now. And I wonder if he did as a player. I mean, he was always pretty good with the media and he was always pretty good in press conferences. But I wonder, say, for example, when he had to quit the Australian team as captain and as a player, I wonder how he felt about the media giving their opinions then, because often players are happy when they hear good opinions, but when the opinions are bad, they don't like it. So it's very interesting. It is difficult giving your opinions. Tim Payne has said previously that he's had players he used to be teammates with who've contacted him unhappy with certain comments he's made. I can tell you I've certainly messed up some relationships with the number of things I've said on this podcast. With the current Australian Test captain, we used to have a good relationship, but I don't think he took my criticisms of his captaincy particularly well. And I know there's other players and people in the press box who don't like it when people go at them, which is fine. I think that you got to have from my point of view is I do everything. The audience of this show is way more important to me than what someone else might think of me. So I know people in the media, are more concerned about what other people in the media think of them, whereas I don't care. I'm just going to say what I think, and I do it because, I have a great audience and I really appreciate the people that listen to this show, and I want them to keep listening. And therefore, I think it's important when you can to be as honest as possible and give your opinions. I'm pretty sure that the English press pack are going to give me the cold shoulder next summer because I've continually criticized them for their coverage of this current English team. There's other people, players, media that just don't get it, and you pay the price for that. But I don't mind losing a few friends as long as you keep listening to Cricket Unfiltered. All right, so let's get into my preview of the Australian summer. And as I said, I want to go through each player individually and give my insights into what I think makes up that player and what I think makes them tick. Let's start. So I'm going to go through the test side in batting order. And when we come to the opening spot, I might talk about a couple of players who will be in contention for that opening spot. But let's start with Usman Khawaja. So Usman Khawaja, what do I think of Usman Khawaja? Well, I actually haven't interviewed him on Cricket Unfiltered. I did when he started his podcast. A colleague, manager type figure of his reached out to me and asked for some advice. I said I would give that advice, but I would love Usman Khawaja to come on Cricket Unfiltered. And then when I emailed Usman, he never got back to me. So that was kind of annoying. So I'll preface that by saying, I guess I wouldn't say hold a grudge, but I don't like it when people don't do what they say they're going to do. But look, Usman is a very arrogant person, I would say. Not that he's not humble, but there's a certain arrogance to him. And I do think to be a really good batter at test level, you have to have that sort of arrogance. I mean, you have to have that belief in yourself and that sort of competitive nature. I mean, Viv Richards is a great example of that, the way he used to walk to the crease. And I think Usman Khawaja's the greatest indication of his arrogance is the fact that he self-appointed himself the people's champ. Normally, if you're the people's champ, the people appoint you as the people's champ, not the other way around. But as a player, a very good technical player, lovely to watch. And he spoke, and he's gone through two very successful periods in Test cricket. Just sort of prior to Sandpaper Gate in South Africa, the 2 years before that were very, very prosperous for him at Test level. And he was doing really well. He made big scores all over the place. But then I think there was some disappointment that when Smith and Warner were banned, he wasn't able to step up and become that senior batter. And in fact, when Smith and Warner came back into the side, he found himself dropped. I know when Smith and Warner were banned, I thought, okay, this is Khawaja's opportunity. Be the man. And he didn't. He went through a couple of patchy years. He found himself out of the team. And then we know the story. He came back in the last Ashes series in Australia when Travis Head was ruled out by COVID at the last minute, made those twin centuries, and has since then put together a phenomenal run at the top of the order. I will say this year at Test level is averaging in the 30s, and he'll be 38 in December. So he could be getting to that tipping point where you just lose a fraction of your sharpness, and therefore he could be found out at Test level. I don't think it is I don't think there's any sort of special formula to his new success at Test level. I think he's just done what you need to do. He's tightened up outside the off stump. If you look at a lot of dismissals prior to returning to the Test side, a lot of the time he would slash outside off stump. Now he's playing a much more intelligent game where he's anything wide, unless it's a wide half volley or a really short ball, he's just leaving it. And he's saying to the bowlers, bowl at me. And when they do, he's very good now at just turning away on the onside, turning the strike over, getting to the other end. And when he does play shots, he's wonderful to watch, and it is a great story. An immigrant to this country from Pakistan who's reached the highest level. And now I think the optics of that are very good for young people in this country. There's so many South Asians immigrating to Australia. Khawaja's shown them what could be possible. And he's also been very vocal on the racism and things he had to face when he was coming through the system. So I admire him, and my criticism of him of being a bit arrogant, they're not really criticism, they're just a comment. I do like Usman, and I have to say, in 2017, he went through a terrible form slump and then turned it around with a century at the SCG against Pakistan. And I've got to say, that was one of the more emotional moments as a cricket spectator. Almost a tear welled up because I want to see him do well. I was there at his Test debut in Sydney in 2010-11 when he played against the Poms. and I want him to do well. And I think, when he raised his bat to his mum, who was in the crowd that day in 2017, it was very emotional. Anyway, that's Usman Khawaja. All right. So there's a few options about who could open the batting with him at the top level. I'm just going to pick a couple. So I'm going to Marcus Harris as one option who might open the batting. And I would say don't sleep on Marcus Harris. He seems to be undervalued and underrated in Australian cricket. But what Harris has done in the last few years is he's been able to develop a good all-round game. He's gone to England and played a lot of county cricket, and where you play in a lot of different conditions. And I think it's really helped his game. I think he's a much better batter than when he played Test cricket. And as a bloke, he came on Cricket Unfiltered during COVID when we did our lockdown specials. And he is your typical knockabout Aussie larrikin. Loves a bit of a laugh, a bit of a troublemaker. You would have seen him celebrating when they retained the Ashes in 2019 on the field, late at night. I mean, he is a bit of a jokester. He's got a great spirit. He's just your typical Aussie cricketer. Loves a laugh, doesn't seem to take himself too seriously. And, he's a player that, he just wasn't able to nail his opportunities at Test level. But when India were here last time, he played a couple of really good innings. And I do think he's underrated. So I'd like to see him given another chance at Test level. I think we talked about it on the show, but he called Andrew McDonald and blew up at him when he was overlooked as Warner's replacement last summer. And that is a real quandary for a player. If you're that spare batter for a long time and then all of a sudden tactics change and they decide to go another way, it can be very frustrating. But Harris, good knockabout Aussie bloke. He's a glue guy. He's a team guy. So I'd like to see him given an upper opportunity. The other one is Cameron Bancroft, conventional opener. And we all know what he's had to endure. Sandpaper Gate, he was the one that seemed to not bear the brunt of it, but because he wasn't, a rusted on Test player, I will know he was recalled for the beginning of the 2019 Ashes, so he was given an opportunity straight away. But because he wasn't a rusted on Test player, he's never really been able to rebuild his brand after what happened, his personal brand. And from what I know of Cameron Bancroft, he's very unique. He thinks about the world differently. He's not your typical cricketer. He's very zen. He's very into mindfulness and the mental game of cricket. But he has, despite all the pressure on him, despite wherever he goes, he's probably linked to Sandpaper Gate. He's gone to England and scored runs. For WA, he's scored runs. In all formats, he's been an unstoppable force in domestic cricket right around the world. And I personally don't love the way he bats. I mean, I'm not saying he couldn't do well at Test level. I don't think he's particularly pleasing on the eye. The way he moves across the crease, I think, is problematic at Test level. But he's a very good player, and there's no doubt if he's given an opportunity, he will deserve it. As I was recording this, the Australia A squad was announced, and he and Harris are both part of it. So he has an opportunity to knock the door down. But I would say unique would be the best word to describe Cameron Bancroft. All right, next player. Let's go to Marnus Labuschagne, the number 3. Well, Marnus first came on this podcast in early 2019 when he was playing at Glamorgan. I interviewed him in the lead up to his recall into the Ashes tour. And Marnus is one of the more interesting characters that are a part of this Australian team. And he's, we all see his footage of him and Smith, and they're great mates and they hang out together and they're cricket nuffies. We all know that about Marnus. But I think what's missed with Marnus is he has a very firm core underlining all of this sort of stuff you see on the surface. He actually is very centered. And if you go back to my very first interview, I talked a little bit about what his faith means to him. Is, he's quite religious, but I think, that faith has given him a real grounding, a real ability to stay centered. He's also been in a long-term relationship, which I think has also helped. But he's not talked about as being a future Australian captain very much. But I actually think he has a lot of the attributes that would make up a good Australian captain. He has a very firm moral compass. He's got a great attitude. He's very positive. He's very energetic. And he's someone who could lead by inspiring others. We saw him take over the reins of Queensland last week and all of a sudden start sending funky fields and doing all sorts of things. But as a character, Marnus is a terrific guy, salt of the earth Aussie. I know he's originally from South Africa. And I also think that's had a real influence on him, being a young immigrant to this country, much like Usman Khawaja. I think Marnus might have been a bit older than Usman when he came out here. But even Marnus saying, call me Labuschagne, because he didn't want the Aussies to try and say Labuschagne. I think he's done really well immersing himself into the Australian cricket culture. And as I said, he has more of a grounding and more of a center than people give him credit for. People see him at the top, fidgeting with everything and doing crazy stuff on the field and wandering off slowly. He's emotional, but I would say my overriding feeling about Marnus that image we see of him actually covers up quite a thoughtful person. And now that he's getting a little bit older, in his 30s, started a family, I think he would be a very good candidate to be the next Australian Test captain. All right, well, we've run out of time. It's 22 minutes. I'm trying to keep these Mad Manners short. So you know what that means? Next week on Mad Manners, I'm going to continue my preview of the players. So we'll pick up at number 4 with Steve Smith. We'll try and go through the rest of the 11 in the next Mad Manners. But thanks everybody for listening. Remember, you can get an ad-free version of Cricket Unfiltered on Patreon. Please go and subscribe there. If you subscribe to the paid levels, you get ad-free versions of all the Cricket Unfiltered podcasts. I will be back with a full episode of Cricket Unfiltered this week with Damien and Daniel. Lots of news to cover off. Obviously, we'll get into the Cameron Green stuff, but just after I record this, I'm going to jump on a press conference with George Bailey. He's announced the Australian one-day squad to play Pakistan and the Australia A squads to take on India. So lots to get to with that. But thanks everybody for listening to Mad Manners. Please rate and review the podcast. Like it if you're watching on YouTube, and we'll be back.